Categorically Romance podcast. My name is Bree, and such an honor today. Author Brenda Novak is joining me. Miss Brenda, thank you for being here. It's just such an honor for you to be joining me today. Thank you so much.
Oh, I'm excited to be here. Appreciate the invitation.
Well, I mean, you're a pretty big deal to me, and I'm sure to like most of the listeners, but for anyone who may, for some reason, not know who you are, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I've been in the business a while. I can tell you that. I started with my first book in November of 1999. So this is my 25th year since I signed my first publishing contract. So it's a bit of a milestone for me. The book that just came out, The Seaside Library, is actually my 75th book. So double milestones there. I'm a mother of 5. I started writing when I caught my daycare provider drugging my children with cough syrup and Tylenol to get them to sleep all day
I
while I
read that
waited.
online and I hoped it wasn't true, but okay.
Yes, it was definitely true. But it was a woman who belonged to my church. She would come over. I mean, it was in-home daycare. It wasn't at a daycare place. And so she would, she did so many fun things with them and she acted like she loved them. I believed it. She came over after hours. She joined us for holidays. She spent a lot of the money we paid her, even on the kids. And so I was just shocked. It came out of nowhere for me. But then, of course, certain things began to make sense where I was like, oh, that's why this happened. And that's why that happened. And I felt terrible because, mother's guilt, you're your children's last line of defense. So this is the last thing you'd want to have happen when you feel like, they're your responsibility and the loves of your life. And you let this happen somehow get past you. So I quit my job to stay home with them, but I needed to do something to earn a living. And so my sister had sent me a good book. It was Jude Devereux's Knight in Shining Armor. And back then I didn't even know really what a genre was. I mean, I was just very green. I read widely, but I didn't pay attention to genre. It wasn't important to me. I just read whatever I liked, caught my attention. And so I was reading this time travel romance and I just thought, this is wonderful. And I remember closing it thinking, I wonder if I can do this. This is something I can do at home while I watch my kids. So I started the next day determined to write a historical set in England.
Wow. Okay, so tell me about your journey to getting published.
Yeah, well, I was at a time when I was having these little kids. I had 3 of them. I had 2 more after, and the internet wasn't quite what it is today. It wasn't anything
Mhm.
like what it was today. It was just getting started, and so you couldn't use it for research, or you could barely use it to connect with other people. I remember making a friend in England on some forum. Anyway, so there was nothing on it. You couldn't use that. So I would have to wait for my husband, who was working very hard to save his business. He's a big risk taker and I'm risk averse.
Mhm.
So you know how they say opposites attract. And he was doing very
Sounds like me and
well,
my husband.
right? Yeah, it seems to work out that way. But he was, doing great at commercial real estate. And he came to me and said, I want to become a residential developer. And I was like, no. There's so much risk involved in that. Like, no, we're young and we've got this brand new family. And he said, well, what if instead of doing spec building, I pre-sold them all? And I thought, oh yeah, like that takes the risk out of it. So as long as you pre-sell them, the homes are sold. When you start building them, we're good. But even that didn't work because the market just totally fell apart. So by the time he could get the homes, he had 30 of them in various stages of construction. By the time he could get them finished, the market had dropped so far that the appraisals were coming in below our cost.
Oh my gosh.
And you only have 2 choices in that instance. You can sell that, keep it as a rental, but you have temporary financing. So that's not very viable. Or you can sell it at a loss. And so he was just working night and day trying to, make enough money to cover its losses. And here I am at home feeling like I can't help. And so he would come home at the end of the day and it'd be late, like 8. And he would left before I got up, and I'd shove whatever kids were awake at him, and I'd run down to Sac State Library and do the research. So it took me 5 years because I not only had to teach myself the craft, I had to teach myself everything about the era in which I was writing. So I should have written contemporary. That's the moral of that story. But anyway, so that took a while to finish a manuscript, and I was just out on my own. I didn't know one other person who was doing it. I wasn't aware of any writing organizations. I had no contacts in publishing. So once I finished this 800-pound behemoth or 800-page behemoth, it was way too long. I, lift my head up at that point to think, okay, what do I do with it now? And luckily, it was a person that I had lunch with. She was a member of my church. I'm no longer religious, but this was at the time. And so I met with her and she said, have you ever heard of Romance Writers of America?" And I said
Oh
I
my
hadn't.
gosh.
And she said, because she had read it for me, which was very nice. She goes, "This
Mhm.
is good. You should look them up and go." And so I showed up. I think it was definitely in Texas, but I don't remember if it was Dallas or Houston that year. And I was 5 months pregnant with my fifth child, and I had this big manuscript that I wanted to sell. And that's when I realized, of course, that it was way too long and it wasn't focused enough to even really be considered a historical romance. It was more kind of just a straight historical with some romance in it. And so I knew I had to make changes, but I was so excited because I had found my tribe. I knew that I could get the connections and information that I needed to get published through this avenue, which had previously I hadn't even known existed. So I came home just so high. Like it took me months to come down. I was so excited. And I rewrote that manuscript and made it a svelte 430 pages and submitted it to the Golden Heart. And it finaled, and so that was definitely a leg up. My aunt, we had no money. We were still going through this turbulent aftermath of the loss of his business and our home, and so we were just still trying to make ends meet. And my aunt heard that oh, it was his aunt actually, our aunt Channy, heard that I wasn't going to get to go because it would cost about $2,500. I just couldn't take that away from the family, and she sent me a check for that amount
Oh
so
my
that I wouldn't miss
gosh.
it. Yeah, which was so nice. It came out of nowhere. I hadn't even talked to her. Ted must have mentioned it. And so I was able to attend, and I didn't final, but it definitely helped me to get an agent that year who sold that manuscript to HarperCollins, and that became Of Noble Birth, which is what came out in November of 99.
That is okay, 5 years first and foremost is amazing because I can easily see a lot of writers just giving up, like, life circumstances or whatever, like, where did that determine was it everything coming around you? Was it that mother instinct of, like, "I have to do something, I have kids," like, where did that motivation to keep going for the 5 years? And then even after, like, revising and all of that, like, where do you think it stemmed from?
I think I'm a very driven person. Once I set my sights on something, like I won't give up until I get there, and I think that that persistence has always served me well in whatever I have tried. I think that those 5 years went quickly as well because I was having those 2 other children and had a
Mhm.
lot to do family-wise. And I also feel like once I started writing, I loved it so much that I felt like this was the silver lining to our dark time. Like I remember going to bed at night thinking, but my book is good. Like I love what I'm doing. And it was so exciting to find those precious moments when I could actually work on it. Cause, even staying at home with kids doesn't mean you're free to work. You have a
Yeah.
lot you have to do to take care of them. So it was difficult to find those precious moments to be able to work. And I had a lot to learn in that short time. So just a lot of balls in the air. So it took a long time, but I am very persistent person and a very driven person. And so I was going to finish come hell or high water.
Yes. I love that I can totally imagine it, like, I've been a stay-at-home mom since 2019 now, and I can totally imagine it also evolving into, like, the thing you kind of sneak away and do for yourself.
Exactly. That's exactly what it was. I would almost count the minutes until it was nap time because that was my hour and a half that I had to myself. But of course, getting them all to sleep at the same time isn't always easy
Oh, yeah.
either. So, you have these precious hour here, maybe an hour there that you could actually do something. And so it did take time, but I remember just how much I loved what I was learning, what I was doing, and feeling as though, I'd found the thing I wanted to do the rest of my life, whether I ever sold a book or not. I absolutely loved the creativity involved in it.
I have to ask, and then I promise we're gonna get into all of my crazy questions about the Seaside Library,
Yeah,
but
no problem.
you wrote quite a few books for Harlequin's super romance line. How did that happen?
Well, actually, I probably would have been a one book wonder if not for one decision that I made, and I'm still kind of shocked I made the decision. So this, I just got off tour for 2 months, and it gave me a chance to reflect and talk about various turning points in my career, and this one is a huge one. I actually, after I sold Of Noble Birth, it was coming out in November of 99, but before that, they only bought it on a one-book contract. And so I didn't know if, my longevity with them would last, but I turned in 2 more manuscripts, proposals, and my editor loved them and said, as soon as I get back from vacation, we'll go to contract. So I thought my historical career was on track. Well, she goes to Europe for a couple months. I go to this mini conference in Utah, Park City, Utah. I don't even know why I did it. It's like 12 hours from where I live, but I am from there. So I was born there. So we go back there occasionally. Anyway, so I decided to do this conference, and there was only about 30 women there, and there was only one editor, but her name was Paula Eichelhoff, and she edited the Harlequin super romance line. I had never read a super romance, but I had read many little Harlequins when I was in high school. And I, at this point, had no intention of ever writing contemporary.
Mhm.
But when she said she was taking pitches, I'm kind of the type of person that tries to prevent failure by taking advantage of what I can take advantage. Because if something bad happens to me that I had no control of, I feel much worse than if something bad happens to me that I could have avoided.
Yes.
So I decided I was going to pitch her something because she was taking pitches. So it was a group pitch. There was like 8 of us. I thought of an idea. I went in with the others and we pitched it. And I felt like I did a very poor job. I was scared. I was new. But Paula was very patient and kind, and she would draw us back to the real thread of the story and ask questions so you could tell she was actually listening and she wasn't just phoning it in, and, was kind to these scared newbies. And so after I got home, I saw her name in a trade journal, the RWR, and it reminded me of this woman and how kind she'd been. And so I just sent her a thank you note in a box of C's saying, thank you for being so kind to newbies. And I never even intended to write contemporary. So I thought that would be the end of it. Well, she called me up once she got it. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is like back then you couldn't self publish. So if you couldn't get in through the gatekeepers, those manuscripts just languished under your bed and all that time and effort was wasted. So it was like getting a call from God. And, because they had that much power over your dreams. And so I'm like, oh my gosh, I was, dry mouthed and sweating and like, oh, what do I say? What do I say? And she said, are you ever going to turn in that manuscript that you pitched me? And I said, I knew what the right answer was. So I said, yes. And she said, well, I can't buy anything with Firefighter Hero because I already have somebody doing firefighters, but do you have any other ideas? And again, I knew the right answer. So I said, yes. And I was just praying she wouldn't ask me for those ideas right away because I had nothing, not one thing. And she said, well, write up, one-page summary of your ideas, and we'll get together and you can pitch them to me at breakfast at RWA, at the next RWA. And I was just shocked that she had handed me this golden opportunity. So I was thrilled at the same time. So I started trying to think up ideas, and I did 5 one-page synopses. And I met her at RWA, and she chose her favorite of the 5, and she bought it as Expectations, which was my first super romance and my second book. And why that turned out to be so important is because when my other editor at HarperCollins came back, she came back to a pink slip. So that meant she lost her job and
Oh my gosh.
I lost my slot. I didn't even have a book out yet. I was, Brenda Who. What was happening was HarperCollins was buying Avon, and what they wanted was their romance department. So they fired all their own romance editors and most of their romance authors, keeping only the big names and moving them to a new editor. So that was the end. Before my book ever came out, I was basically had already lost my job in the historical romance area. So fortunately, because of Paula, I was able to segue into writing contemporary, and she bought everything I could produce for the next 20 plus years, over 60 books. So it
Wow.
was a very fortuitous decision
Yes.
um, to attend that conference, to pitch to her, and to thank her.
Oh my gosh, the stars just aligned or something. That's amazing. Shout out to
Yeah,
Miss
I owe
Paula.
her a lot. She's amazing. She's always very kind and steady, and between that turning point and then how I broke back into single title, those were kind of the 2 big ones in my career.
Yeah, because your like you have a lot of romantic suspense. Like, where do you think that came from? Did you read a lot of mysteries?
I just like books with a strong conflict.
Okay.
And so suspense has one of the strongest conflicts. To me, that's what a page turner is. Your conflict is what drives the engine of your story, and you race forward, to turn pages when it's a big conflict. Like, I don't know if you think of Game of Thrones or Outlander, like there's so much conflict in those, which I love. So that, and my books also have a lot of conflict. So I do drift towards suspense a lot.
Mhm.
But the reason how I ended up in romantic suspense was I was writing. This brings me to the second turning point I was talking about. I was writing for super romance, and I wanted to break back into single title. But I didn't know how to do it because once an editor has a stable of authors that she's groomed and she trusts, she's not going to be really excited if you go off and publish for a different program. So I knew Paula wouldn't probably be super excited to see me do this, but I really, really wanted to have a book out on the shelf that lasted longer than a month and that could grow my career. And so I thought, I know I'll write such a good book, they'll just have to recognize it as a single title. This was my plan. So I pitch it to my agent and Paula at conference, and they both say, okay, yeah, write it. So I go home and I write it, and I loved it. I thought it was the best thing I'd written so far. I was super excited about it. And so I turn it into my agent, and she calls me up, and I get this voice on the other end of the phone that says, Brenda, this is a prison book.
Oh
And
gosh.
I was like,
Okay.
it was a prison book when I pitched it to you. Were you not listening? Do you know
Yeah.
what prison means? Like, I was flabbergasted. And she goes, it's dark. And I'm thinking,
Mm.
well, to her, obviously, dark is bad, right? To me, it was suspense. So I'm thinking, yeah, I like that strong conflict. And so, but I was new enough still that it devastated me because I thought, oh, here I thought it was good and it's terrible. Obviously, if your agent says it's terrible, it's terrible. So I thought, oh, wow, I blew it. I wasted all this time. And, so I'm in tears and I call Paula and I say, I'm not even going to submit this. It's terrible. You'll hate it. Karen hates it. And she said, Brenda, I'm the person who buys your books, not your agent. Send it to me. So I sent it to her with very little hope. And sure enough, she loved it so much that she passed it all around the publisher. I had people coming up to me at the next RWA conference whom I'd never met. I didn't know their names previous to this, and they certainly didn't know mine. I should have known theirs because I was writing for the publisher, but they were just so far up, I wasn't paying much attention. And they said, we just read your book. We love it. We're going to turn it into a single title. We're going to invite you to sales conference and have you speak. And so I was, I did get the break I was hoping for, but it came as a big shock because, my agent hadn't even liked the book. She wanted romantic comedy, which is something I don't write. And so it was just kind of an interesting twist of fate. And so luckily Paula did recognize it for what it was, and everybody at Harlequin loved it, and they did turn it into a single title that was called Taking the Heat. And then I had the opportunity to write more single titles that led me down the same road, which is how I got into romantic suspense.
Your books do have some of the most, like, standout conflict that I've ever read. Was that something that you feel like you taught yourself, that you had to learn? Was it, like, an overtime thing? Was it from reading? Like, where do you think that stemmed from?
I think it was from my tastes in reading and sort of your own intuition as a writer. I know that in the beginning I could not read how to write books because it took everything that I did unconsciously or subconsciously rather and schlepped it all over to the conscious side. So then you're juggling so many balls you just freeze up and can't write. So I'd start to write, oh no, that's passive language, or oh no, that's POV switch in the middle of a scene. So once you start limiting yourself, it makes it harder and harder to just spill it out on the page. And so I decided I would learn from example and from what I loved to read and turn off these voices that were giving me all these rules and how to. Now I can read those books and enjoy them because I feel like I have enough experience I can apply and learn from them without being overwhelmed and frozen by them.
So for anybody that's listening that's writing, give us, like, one piece of advice on writing a strong conflict, or how to know if the conflict isn't strong enough.
Oh gosh, that's sort of a feeling. You can tell, and even as a reader, you can tell as you're reading. Like I read a book once where this was very obvious, where it was a hero and a heroine, where I could see why the initial conflict would work and be fun at first. She didn't, their families were at odds with each other, but they had never had any personal interaction. This went back a generation or two. And so I could see, oh, that's one of those, whatever the name was of that family. I don't like him. But then this writer had that try and carry the whole book. And it gets repetitive. It
Mm.
gets slow. It starts making you roll your eyes because you're like, oh my gosh, she's got to forgive him by now. He isn't even the one who did it.
Yeah.
Right. So you're like, are you kidding me? So that type of reaction, you can feel it as a reader, and as a writer, you can feel it too. Like if you're starting to get bogged down, you probably need a change because conflict needs to grow, and evolve as well as your characters. Like, you don't want, typically in most books, you'll start out with a conflict, but then it has to breathe and grow too, so that's how you keep those pages turning, right? So with me, I always start with what the conflict is in any book. That's the only way I know how to do it, because that to me is, I'm finding something I'm interested in writing about. Then I look at what characters would be most challenged by this conflict. And then as I write, I kind of write by the seat of my pants and let the plot grow out of this conflict mixed with these characters. So that's just my process. That probably won't work for everyone, because everybody has to respect their own process. But I just always come up with what I consider a delicious conflict. And that's what makes me want to dive in and start to write.
These books that you've been releasing, so we have the Seaside Library this summer. Um, we had the bookstore on the beach. We had One Perfect Summer, which were both just as amazing. How did we get into this lane of, like, I don't even know how you would, like, how you describe these books. Like, Seaside Library was a fun twist on, like, a murder mystery, but they're all three, like, also kind of women's fiction-y. Like, how did we get in this lane that we're currently in?
I wish I knew. I don't really know. I think your writing is just an extension of what you love to read. And so I put in my stories things I would find intriguing. So, I do tend to blend genres, which makes it a challenge for my publisher, because if it was just plain old women's fiction, and not as in that boring, just meaning that's, pure women's fiction. If it was just pure women's fiction, that's how I should state it, then it'd be easy to put a cover on it. If it
Mhm.
was a romance or a mystery, like, these are easily defined genres. But when you mix them all together, then it's difficult to represent that book with a cover adequately and attract the right readers. So that has been the challenge that I have faced almost from the beginning of my career, because I've always sort of balanced, my romance has always drifted toward women's fiction, and now that I am writing women's fiction, of course, I still have elements of romance and mystery and sometimes suspense, that filters into the story.
And see, I think that's why I love these books, because I do love women's fiction, but I need something else. And so this balance of the suspense and the women's fiction is just perfect for me, I feel like. Can
Yeah.
you share with us, like, give us an elevator pitch for the Seaside Library?
It's about 3 friends. It sort of explores themes of loyalty
Mhm.
versus integrity. And that is such a push-pull in this book between all the characters, that's really essentially what it's about. It's about 3 friends who, have grown up on this island, and they're very close because they're year-rounders. And this is an island that has, a big influx of tourists, that, like 90,000, the population swells to like 90,000 and then goes down to like 10. So just a huge difference. So these young kids would almost feel like nothing is stable in their life. All the friends that they make, or nothing lasts, I should say. I mean, they would have the stability of their families depending on their families. But anyway, so they would be especially close and be wanting to protect each other. So when one of the 3 friends, the male member, is the last person to interact with a 12-year-old girl who goes missing, they step right up to, their loyalty demands that they give him an alibi. They know he could never do this. But of course, 20 years later, when the girl's body is found and certain other things come to light, even they have to question whether they made the right decision. And it just kind of explores how, sometimes we make decisions that we don't know we're going to have to live with our whole lives. And maybe we will rethink those. But then if they come forward and do what they think is probably right, which is come forward and tell the truth, an innocent person could go to prison for the rest of his life simply because their lie will make him look more guilty. So they have a lot of difficult decisions to face. So it's about friendship and loyalty and integrity, and of course it has the mystery running through it as well.
Our 3 friends are Ivy, Ariana, and Cam. What were you like? Okay, this book is so bonkers in the best way possible. Like, I have to know first. I was thinking, it hit me days later. I was like, this kind of I was a kid in, like, the 90s, or teenager in the early 2000s. I was like, this kind of reminds me of I Know What You Did Last Summer. Like, these group of teens, something
Yeah.
happened, and, like, that what if of, like, the secret that they carry with them. Like, how did the story come to you? Was it the 12-year-old girl? Was it the friendship? Like, how did it come to you?
Well, I knew I wanted to write about 3 friends because, beach read, friendship's always a lovely theme for the summer and you get away with your friends. And so I knew I wanted to write about 3 friends, but I didn't want it to be just 3 girlfriends. I wanted to mix it up a little because I thought, with if you threw a male member in there, especially if one of them ever had romantic feelings for that other person, it would really make the friendships, there could enter jealousy, there could, I mean, it could really mix things up. So that's probably where I started with it. But I also like the element of, how far would you go for that friendship? What
Mhm.
would you do? And so I love books about people who make the wrong decision, but for the right reason. And so I wanted the reader to be able to identify with what Ariana and Ivy do, even though it may not be technically, what we believe to be right. Like you should always come forward and tell the truth to the police.
In the beginning, I'd say the first couple of chapters, I think it's the first chapter we get from Cam's perspective. I was like, "I don't know." The way that you ended it, I was like, "Did he do it?" So, like, when you started it, did you know did you know how the ending was going to be, or was there anything plot-wise that kind of took you by surprise?
No, I never know the ending of my books because I guess I get easily bored, and if I plotted it out ahead of time or wrote an outline, I'd feel like I was already told that story and I'm just done with it, and I find that if I'm bored with my work, then it just goes emotionally flat and you lose all that delicious tension that makes people want to read forward, and so I can't know. That being said, I was fairly certain Cam would not be guilty, but I
Mhm.
wasn't positive. And so it did come up where a few times I'm thinking, ooh, it would be interesting. Should he really be the one who did it or not? So it played out in my mind the same way it did the readers, where I wanted him to be innocent, but I'm thinking, I don't know. I mean, maybe this will be the most logical and exciting conclusion to the book. So I didn't want to limit myself.
Yeah, and I think that, something you touched on and, one of the biggest, I think, aspects of the book is as you continue reading the story, you really do see how this secret and here it's 20 years later, but, holding the secrets amongst friends, like, that's the easiest way to say it, like, how it is kind of affecting their friendship is, like, there is a little Ariana admits that she has always had this crush on Cam, and so we slowly start to see them spending time together, but it is 3 of them. And so Ivy, you kind of feel bad for Ivy. She doesn't really know what's going on. She just knows like my 2 friends are like hanging out without me. So like was that something you were aware that you were going to do, like something kind of has to come between them?
Yeah, I just really felt that again, letting that conflict breathe and take on a different shape. Like at first, you have the doubt whether we should have done this, but then you complicate it a little more when you learn, oh wow, she actually has had feelings for him. So is she doing it because of her feelings for him? And what about, like you say, what about Ivy and how that plays into their friendship? So it just sort of escalates the conflict.
And I really, really loved Ivy because Ivy solves, like, a really important part of the story. So can you talk about that particular moment for her?
Yeah, I knew I wanted to do a big reveal in the library because the library is the title of it. And I really felt like it wasn't tying in strongly enough as much as it probably should have. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to have this big reveal in the library, which made it clear that Ivy would be the one. And plus I felt like she needed more of a job to do since there was probably more page time I felt like for the other two. So I made her an integral part of the resolution, or a piece of the puzzle I gave to her, and she discovers it in the library. But yeah, no, I just really liked the way how at first, if you were high schoolers and you did something like this, I think it would draw you closer together,
Mhm.
because you've got this secret and it's you three against the world. And but then as you go on about your life 20 years later, it would actually probably create fissures and cracks in that friendship because now you're bearing the responsibility for something that you feel guilty of and maybe that you're no longer so sure about. And so I just really liked the dynamic of what that could do to a friendship.
We have to talk Jewel, okay? 'Cause
She's a jewel, isn't she?
I really did not like Joel. At first I did, but then the more that even before, you get to the end of the book, I'm like, "Man, she is really fixated on this guy." And I think that she is such a wonderfully written character, especially like the further you get into the book because she shows you showed through her it's almost like it's a reputation thing. Like, it's a reputation thing, but also, like, I loved when you had her call her dad, and her dad's like, "You wouldn't do this because blah, 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 blah." Like, you gave us the thing I feel like she told herself, like, I couldn't do something like this." Like, listeners, she actually, like, has a one night of fun with one of the characters. And so she, like, believes these things about herself, like, "I wouldn't do this because of this, but we
Yeah,
clearly know that she did," kinda thing. And I
yeah,
think that you show, like, I think one of the really powerful things that stuck out with me was, like, the lengths people will go to protect reputation and how I'm supposed to present myself and, like, this
yes.
person that I'm supposed to be. But I loved that you gave us chapters from her perspective. So, like, what inspired the decision to give us those moments with Jewel?
I think that those less perfect characters are some of the funnest to write. I just really love getting into the psyche of how a narcissistic person thinks, and how that would present itself. And she shows in many instances how selfish she is, and yet the fact that she is there to solve the crime, and there to support her parents and all those things. When you're first starting the book, you're reading this, and that makes her seem quite admirable to be standing up and fighting even all these years later.
I think what was interesting, like, as you're reading Joel's perspective is, like, Cam has been living his life. Him and Ivy both they still live on the island, and, like, nobody really treated him any differently. And you kind of have the sense that, like, the law enforcement are like, "We don't really have anything to, like,
Right.
stick it to someone." But then you're reading from her perspective, and, like, obviously her motivation is like, "This is my sister. Like, I want you guys to catch somebody, and, like, let's end this thing. It's been long enough."
Yeah.
But, like, they're like, we don't really have anything. It's been a really long time." So did you purposely want to make that that a little bit difficult for her?
Well, that actually to me reads pretty true. I watch a lot of true crime, and it's shocking and saddening to realize that many, many crimes don't get solved simply
Mhm.
because either police aren't motivated enough or they're not capable, or one or the other. And so in this situation, and I've also learned that unless there's family members who dog their heels, I mean, will not give up, push forward, willing to hire private detectives, whatever. I guess I came into this initially before I started writing suspense with rose-colored glasses, thinking the police were all powerful and they would set things right and they cleaned up crime. And then you get into it and you realize that that is not the case. Like I even have a cousin who is a police officer, and he said unless the police have a real reason to grab hold of something, want to go after it. He even had his superiors sometimes telling him, "Oh, don't mess with that." And he's like, "No, I really think I could bust this guy. Like I'm really going for it." So they have to pick and choose. They have limited man hours. They have limited
Yeah.
resources. A lot of the people who gravitate to law enforcement, not to put them down because some are very good, but some are not. Some are just phoning it in. They only want to take their paycheck home to their family. They're not super dedicated. And so you get a mix of people, right? Especially at that income level of what they start at. You're not going to get probably the brightest and the best. So it's very difficult, I feel like, for the police to actually solve a crime. And I am shocked again and again on these true crime shows where I watch these cold cases and then they go, and lo and behold, they read the file, reread the file, and they found the smoking gun. And you're like, that means it was there all the time. That means whoever was doing that 20 years ago either
Yeah.
was too stupid or too lazy or just didn't care, right? So you're like, how does this work out that they always find the smoking gun in the original investigation but missed it? And it just
Yeah.
happens again and again and again. And so to me, that frustration sometimes leaks out, I feel like, in my writing, going, hey, folks, the reality of what the police can do is so limited, it's shocking.
Yeah, and I feel like their location was kind of an antagonist too, because they're on an island. I mean, and like, there's I can imagine that the scenes where you give us, like, where they're, like, one point it's Ariana and Cam, and then it's Ariana and Ivy, like, they're just digging through sand, and I'm like, "That has to be torturous."
That's everybody's dream to be on the beach digging through sand, no?
So out of the 3, was there a favorite character you had to write? Was there one that was a little bit more difficult? Like, I feel like Cam, especially with his wife, like, you really put Cam through it.
Yeah, yeah. I just really felt, but I hope that his wife also came off somewhat sympathetic. I mean, as
Mhm.
difficult of an individual she is, it would be very hard to marry somebody that you feel like married you because you were pregnant, even if you did it on purpose.
Yeah.
You're thinking, oh, if they'll just realize they love me, maybe. I mean, I'm putting myself in her shoes. And then when she can't ever fully really capture his heart, she can't truly believe, can't truly trust, can't truly feel secure and safe, and that would be an unhappy life, right? So even
Yeah.
though she makes his life unhappy because of this insecurity, the basic root of the problem is really outside of either of their control, because you can't tell yourself who to love, right? He tries to do the right thing, he marries her, but then she has to live with her decision that she
Yeah.
trapped him, and now she can't fully believe he loves her. And so I really feel like, while that's not sympathetic in a way because of her actions, in another way you can feel like, God, that'd be terrible, right?
Yeah, yeah. She was a fun character to read. I was like, "Oh,
Yeah,
Miss
I loved
Brenda, you
writing.
are really putting Cam through the ringer."
Yeah, he
But
was probably my favorite character because of that, just because of the complexity of his relationship with his wife and the decisions he had to make there versus what he had to make, about, people feeling as though he was guilty of this terrible crime and maintaining these friendships. And so he has a lot on his plate, and I found him a really interesting character to imagine and to write about.
so can you tell us, like, what are you working on now? Like, what's coming up next from you?
Yeah, I actually have. I have a lot coming out this next year. I have a my last mass market romance trilogy is coming out. It's set in Montana in a fictional town called Coyote Canyon. So Tallulah's Back in Town comes out the end of August, and then The Talk of Coyote Canyon comes out the end of November, and then The Messy Life of Jane Tanner comes out the end of January. So we've got three rapid releases there, and then we've got Tourist Season, which is my next beach read, which comes out next April. It's also set on Mariners, but it's not tightly connected. I mean, the library is obviously there, and Ivy still works at the library, but the two storylines, it's not a continuation or anything. They're standalones. But I just really love that setting and that island enough. I wanted to revisit it with my next story. So those are all done and in the pipeline. And I'm currently starting another trade release that'll be out in the fall of 2024. And I just started that this week. I just got back off of my 2 month long tour for the Seaside Library, and am diving into this new book.
When you sit down to write, like, are you, do you have, like, a daily writing goal, or, like, what does the writing look like for you? And, like, how are you getting all of these books done?
Well, I am pretty, like I said, very driven and determined to reach my goals. So if I set a goal for that day, I typically meet it. But I
Mhm.
try to do, for this summer, I'm going to have to do 6 pages a day, 5 days a week, to get close to finishing this book somewhat on time. I used 2 months of my deadline to do the tour. So I only have 3 months left. I want to get at least 400 pages done. And then mine always go over. The last one was like 550 pages. I hope it won't be that long because that's a lot of work. But 450 probably. So I'll finish it only maybe a couple weeks late, I'm hoping.
Well, last question that I have before we get off of here, like, what is something you know now? Like, what do you know now that if you could go back and tell yourself at the beginning of your writing career, like, what would Miss Brenda now tell Brenda in the beginning?
To relax and enjoy the journey. I think that sometimes we can be pretty hard on ourselves, and the bumps at first were just, some of them were just painful. I had St. Martin's offered to buy Of Noble Birth before HarperCollins did, so I thought I had a sell. I had the call, and then they had me submit one idea as a follow up for the second book. I went away on for a weekend. Ted and I celebrated. It was our anniversary, and thought, okay, I'm going to be a published author. I got the call, and I got back on Monday, and the whole deal was off because they didn't like the second book. No conversation like, do you have anything else, or this is what we didn't like. Nothing. It just completely just derailed. And my agent said, I've never seen anything like that before. Of course, I was just destroyed. And then if you get a bad review when the first book comes out, Ted will come home and be like, I'm laying on the floor almost. He's like, what's wrong with you? I'm like, read this, and you just learn to take it with a little bit different perspective when you've been around a long time, and you learn that, not every book is for every person. You will get bad reviews. Everybody gets bad reviews. To make myself feel better, if I get a bad review, sometimes I'll go on and read the bad reviews of my most favorite books. And I'm always shocked that there can be people who don't like them.
Yeah.
So, just I think to sit back and breathe and enjoy the journey. It's really, what do they say? It's not a sprint, it's a
A
marathon.
marathon, yeah.
And so that's really it's a marathon, and publishing is like a bucking bronco, all these metaphors, but or similes. That one was a simile. And it was, it makes you feel like it's a very difficult business, but it's a very rewarding business. And if it can buck you off, it will. So you have to, I think, do look for ways to prevent that from happening. I think taking your career in your own hands, not just relying on the publisher to promote you, I think is important in that type of thing. Because, it's ultimately comes down to you and your business. And so I think you have to, look at it as a long journey, take stock of what you're going to need, and meet those small goals, which will lead you to the big ones.
Can you tell everybody where they can keep up with you online? Do you have a newsletter you want to shout out and all of that?
Yeah, I have a newsletter. I have a mailing list. They can sign up on my website, which is brendanovak.com. I also have information about my online book group, which is 26,000 members strong, and they are wonderful, wonderful people. It's such a warm group. We do the Brenda Novak book boxes where we all read the same book for that month. I sponsor or feature other authors in the months I don't have a release. So the Brenda Novak challenge, reading challenge each year is 12 books, and they get autographed copies of the book we're reading that month in the Brenda Novak book box, along with other goodies. We have an online meeting with the author to discuss the book. We have parties. We just have a lot of fun things. So people are definitely invited to join me there. We're very active there. And so I just visit brendanovak.com. You can learn all about the books, the book group, and the mailing list.